A single ring breaks decades of silence, revealing murder in its echo. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Drop a comment with your location. Your voices keep this community alive. Settle in. The mystery begins. The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows when the villagers of Winter Hollow began their slow procession toward St. Cuthbert's Church. The Sunday service was always a genteel affair in the sleepy hamlet, and today promised no exception, though there was the added attraction of the newly restored bell tower, due to be unveiled with suitable ceremony. For weeks, workmen from the neighboring town had been up ladders and scaffolding, scraping, painting, and muttering about the difficulty of replacing weather-worn beams. Now the tower's stone gleamed pale in the cool autumn light, its freshly polished bells ready to ring again after nearly 30 silent years. Mrs. Amelia Tranter, brisk in her dark blue coat and hat trimmed with a single pheasant feather, stood near the church gate with a purposeful air, greeting arrivals as though she owned the place. In a way she did, at least socially. She was the vicar's sister, visiting from Bath, and had made herself indispensable to the preparations. Close by, Mr. Lionel Baverstock, the church warden, fussed about with a clipboard, looking anxiously toward the bell tower door. His spectacles caught the light as he checked his watch for the 5th time. On the village green, a trestle table groaned under the weight of sponge cakes, seed loaves, and Mrs. Roper's famous lemon-curd tarts. The plan was for the bell tower unveiling to be followed by modest fete, raffles, tombolas, and all. Children darted between the stalls, their laughter mingling with the low hum of village gossip. Miss Marple, dressed in a neat gray tweed, arrived a little behind the main crowd. She paused to admire the chrysanthemums in the churchyard, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the stone wall. She had been staying with her old school friend, Mrs. Elspeth Harcourt, in the next village, and had agreed, after some gentle persuasion, to attend the unveiling. Her pale blue eyes swept the scene, noting with mild interest how Mrs. Tranter seemed to keep her gaze fixed on the bell tower door, and how Mr. Baverstock's lips pressed tight whenever someone tried to speak to him. At precisely 11, the vicar cleared his throat and called for attention. The crowd gathered before the tower, shuffling and murmuring. A young man in overalls, Tommy Bell, the carpenter's apprentice, stood by the rope that would release the ceremonial covering from the tower's new plaque. The vicar launched into a short speech about heritage, community, and the generosity of donors. A smattering of polite applause followed. Then Tommy tugged the rope. The covering fell away, revealing the plaque in gleaming brass. At the same moment, the great bell above gave a sonorous chime, its first in decades. There was a ripple of excitement. People craned their necks to see the belfry windows. It was then that the collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. A figure was visible in the shadows behind the belfry railings. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The figure, a man, was slumped awkwardly, his head at an unnatural angle. One arm dangled over the railing, his hand limp in the air. Mrs. Tranter gave a sharp cry. Mr. Baverstock dropped his clipboard, the papers scattering like startled pigeons. The bell gave another slow, mournful toll before falling silent again. The vicar's voice, when it came, was strained. "Quickly, fetch Dr. Worsley." As the crowd began to stir, whisper, and cluster in anxious knots, Miss Marple remained quite still, her gaze fixed on the bell tower. In her mind, she was not thinking of tragedy in the abstract. She was noting the smallest details: the rope in Tommy Bell's hand, the exact angle of the man's arm, the curious expression on Mrs. Tranter's face. Winter Hollow, she thought. was about to become rather less peaceful than it had been an hour ago. The shock of the sight above had the usual effect of any sudden drama in a small community. People began to seek tasks as a way to hold themselves together. The vicar, flustered but dutiful, directed 2 men to fetch ladders. Others were dispatched for blankets, as if warmth might be of use to a man whose head hung so unnaturally. Dr. Worsley arrived at a brisk trot from his surgery, hat tilted back, his breath coming in steady puffs in the cool air. A young constable, Pritchard, new to the district and still trying to discover what tone would impress both villagers and superiors, pushed through the cluster with the solemnity of rank and the uncertainty of youth. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had stepped a little closer to the foot of the tower, where the wooden door stood ajar. The smell that issued from within was not merely of old stone and polish. There was a faint tang of something metallic and recent, like the scent that follows a struck bell mingled with fresh linseed oil. Tommy Bell, his knuckles white around the ceremonial rope he had just pulled, was speaking too quickly to anyone who would listen that he had only been told to yank the cover, that the bell's chime was a demonstration arranged by Mr. Baverstock, and that he himself had not touched the ringing rope at all that morning. Mr. Baverstock, hearing his name, turned and shook his head at once, spectacles flashing. He had arranged no demonstration, he said, and if the bell had chimed, it was because something had shifted in the fittings. These things happened with old mechanisms. One must expect peculiarities. Dr. Worsley ascended the stairs with Constable Pritchard behind him, and 2 parish men carried the longer ladder around the side to the small upper door that opened onto the belfry platform. The bell had fallen silent. The crowd had not. Winter Hollow produced explanations, speculations, and condolences at equal speed. Mrs. Amelia Tranter, the vicar's sister, had recovered her composure enough to arrange for tea to be brought from the trestle tables, her hat's pheasant feather nodding with managerial authority. She took care, Miss Marple noted, to keep her own vantage where she could see the tower steps and anyone who came down them. There is a useful economy in keeping one's eyes slightly lowered when others look up. Miss Marple found that people, faced with a calamity above their heads, forgot what their hands and feet were doing. The stone floor just within the tower door was dusted with a faint film. The recent restoration had shaken down fine grit from rafters and corners. Across that pale dust ran a scuff of darker granules, as if something with a rough surface, perhaps the sole of a boot, had slipped and dragged. A small triangular sliver of varnished wood lay against the skirting, no larger than a thumbnail. When she bent, ostensibly to pick up a fallen program sheet, her eyes went to the step where a splinter stood proud, newly broken. Her memory, long and tidy, filed the fact and took nothing in her hands. They brought the man down between them, Dr. Worsley, the constable, and the 2 parish men who had managed the ladder, and laid him upon the folded blanket Mrs. Tranter had arranged with swift propriety. Hats came off in a ripple, faces sharpened, names formed on lips and were bitten back. One doesn't want to be first with a certainty that might yet prove wrong. But when the vicar murmured, "Mr. Elwood," the name went around as if on a draft. Marcus Elwood had been the bell tower's most vigorous champion, a widower from the manor with a taste for projects that polished history and, by extension, the community's sense of itself. He had arrived in Winter Hollow 3 years before, with the habit of benevolence and the self-possession that benevolence often brings. His gift had paid for the new beams and much of the labor. His name was on the shining plaque whose covering Tommy had let fall. Dr. Worsley's hand, steady and unhurried, pressed lightly along the jaw and neck. "He's gone," he said. And then, more quietly to the constable, The neck is not broken, as one might first suppose. There's pressure here. It may be strangulation or some constricting force. Best not disturb him further. He looked up and met the vicar's eyes. We'll need to wait for the inspector from Much Witchford. Pritchard, keep people back from the tower. Miss Marple, who, like many old ladies, is thought harmless by men who should know better, looked at the dead man with a sadness that did not preclude attention. Mr. Elwood's right sleeve bore a faint smear of greenish gray, the kind one gets from handling weathered metal. There was no ringing rope burn across his palms, no obvious signs of a fall beyond a bruise darkening at the temple, likely from where his head had come to rest against the wooden railing when he collapsed. His tie was crooked. The knot sat a fraction askew. On his waistcoat, one button, second from the top, was missing. It would be impetuous, Miss Marple thought, to link that absence to anything at present, yet the loveliest tapestry is often held by a single overlooked stitch. Constable Pritchard, grateful for direction, deployed his authority around the tower more lavishly than his experience warranted, and it served. People drew back, then clustered in little circles and began to talk in earnest. The gossip came first in breathless whispers, and then with gathering confidence, as if speaking the thing made it real, but also governable. Shocking, quite shocking, said Mrs. Roper, distraught enough that the tarts remained untouched on their tray. And to think of it, with his name on the plaque. He always had a nice word for anyone, though I suppose he could be brisk when the accounts came due. Brisk. Mr. Dilly, who runs the post office, allowed himself a snort that wanted to be a laugh, and then remembered it must not be. There's brisk, Mrs. Roper, and there's business. He didn't marry again, did he? Not in 3 years, though some might have thought him likely. Perhaps he had other attachments elsewhere. Attachments, said Mrs. Tranter, appearing as if she had been summoned by the word. She laid a consoling hand upon Mrs. Roper's arm, and then, very incidentally, arranged the tray nearer to herself. People always imagine romantic entanglements. It is rarely that. Mr. Elwood took pains with the church accounts. I trust that did not offend anyone's sense of freedom. She looked with meaning at Mr. Baverstock. The churchwarden pushed his spectacles up and returned the look evenly, though a small muscle worked at his jaw. A donor is entitled to see his gift properly spent, he said, and no one could object to the sentiment while still objecting to the tone. There were overages. The tower needed more than first thought. Mr. Elwood was thorough. Thorough, repeated Miss Marple softly, as if to herself, and her eyes went briefly to Tommy Bell, who had drifted to the fringe of things. The young man's mouth was set in a thin line, and he kept scrubbing at his hands with a rag he took from his pocket and put back, took out, put back again. A habit, Miss Marple thought, born from workshop and oil. He looked not at the body, but at the lower part of the tower door, and his face, in that moment, had the dumb guilt of a boy who has knocked against something precious. Elspeth Harcourt, who had been hovering at Miss Marple's shoulder, leaned nearer. You don't think poor Tommy had any hand? My dear, I think nothing, Miss Marple said, which was untrue and entirely true in the way she meant it. Tommy Bell is very young to carry an older man's quarrels. Someone has been very tidy upstairs, and someone else has been just the tiniest bit careless. Inspector Alec Graves arrived from Much Witchford with the air of a man who distrusts ceremonial occasions and country opinion in equal measure. He was compact, with a weatherproof face and a manner that did not waste good words. He listened to Doctor. Worsley nodded. and then made the acquaintance of Constable Pritchard's cordon with approval that would later be remembered as praise. He took down names with pencil and the patience of a man bait fishing in a slow stream. "Mr. Elwood came alone this morning?" he said, eyes moving not to the vicar, who answered, but to the faces around him. "Alone," the vicar said. He liked to inspect the work early, before the service. He and Mr. Baverstock would sometimes— "Occasionally," Mr. Baverstock interposed with tight civility. "We reviewed progress." "Not today." "And the keys to the tower?" Graves asked. "Who holds them?" The vicar looked to the churchwarden. Mr. Baverstock, with the inevitable little flourish of a person who enjoys the possession of keys more than he admits, produced a ring. "Myself," he said, "and the vicar." Mr. Elwood had a set while works continued, naturally. They were to be returned today, after the ceremony. "Were they returned, Mr. Baverstock?" "I cannot say," Baverstock replied too quickly. "I did not see him this morning." A fraction of a pause. "But the workmen used the side access during the final week. Tommy?" Tommy Bell startled like a rabbit. "Me, sir. I had Mr. Sykes, the foreman. He kept the side door key for the scaffolding. We took it back yesterday. I left it with Mr. Baverstock, sir, when the scaffolding came down." Inspector Graves looked at the young man, then at the churchwarden, and allowed silence to do the asking for him. "It's in my desk," Baverstock said at last. "In the vestry." "We'll have a look," Graves said pleasantly. "Meanwhile, I'd like everyone who was near the tower door after the bell chimed to step forward, one at a time, and tell Constable Pritchard where they stood and what they saw. Not what they thought they saw. What they saw. It is remarkable how a simple instruction will suddenly empty the mind of a dozen important recollections and fill it with the impulse to embellish. Mrs. Roper recalled that she had heard a second chime after the cloth fell from the plaque. Mr. Dilly was sure there had been only one, bold and lonely. Mrs. Tranter believed she saw a shadow move at the upper window the instant before the bell spoke, but could not be entirely certain whether the movement began before or after the cloth dropped. Tommy said he had his hand on the rope and his eyes on the plaque, and that he would swear to it. Elspeth Harcourt thought the wind had lifted the edge of the tarpaulin over the tool chest by the porch, but no one else had noticed any wind at all. Miss Marple, when her turn came, said that she had been looking at the chrysanthemums near the wall, and that when the bell chimed, she looked up and saw the figure, and that it seemed to her that the arm hung in such a manner as to suggest the weight had left the body some little time before. "Only, you know," she added with an apologetic smile, "one sees old men nap in odd positions, and sometimes one thinks more is wrong than truly is." Inspector Graves had a way of listening that made the listener feel cleverer than she was likely to be. He nodded and thanked her, and his pencil did not move. "You have been in Belfries before, ma'am?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a curiosity man allows himself in the presence of something unthreatening. "One sees many things if one keeps one's eyes open," Miss Marple said. "And one hears more if one keeps one's mouth shut, which I am not always clever enough to do." She glanced once toward the tower door, and then, as if the matter were too trivial to mention, added, "The new varnish on the trap rail must have been a bother to whoever went up last. Fresh varnish is the stickiest, I always think. It clings to threads." If the inspector heard the invitation in that, he did not show it. He sent the constable for Mr. Baverstock's vestry key and went himself to examine the interior of the tower. The villagers, reassured that something official was being done, found it possible to drink tea after all. Grief, in a village, is socialized. Each sip is a slight towards panic and a gesture toward order. Elspeth drew Miss Marple a little to one side. "Do you suppose," she murmured, "that Mr. Elwood was the sort of man who collected enemies without meaning to? He pressed people, you know, in the nicest way. Harriet Roper wanted that new oven from the fund for the fete tent, and he told her the oven had nothing to do with bells. Imagine telling Harriet Roper that cakes are not central to salvation." "People don't kill over ovens," Miss Marple said. "They kill over pride, fear, and the hateful sense that something which should have been theirs is slipping away. Ovens can be the pretext, but they are rarely the reason." She watched Mrs. Tranter move among the clusters with a hostess's smile and a general's glance, felt the prickle of the village's nerves collect around her like thistledown, and saw, very plainly because no one else did, Tommy Bell's eyes fix upon the vestry door where Mr. Baverstock had just gone with Inspector Graves. Young men who fear for their situation, Miss Marple thought. Fear for employment. Older men fear for reputation. The dead fear nothing at all, and so the living must do it for them. Presently Graves returned with a small brown key in a marked envelope and a note of dissatisfaction he concealed for the sake of good order. The side door key was not in the vestry desk. Mr. Baverstock expressed astonishment that bordered on affront. Perhaps he had mislaid it yesterday when the final inventory was made. It would turn up. Such things always did. Graves said they would continue to look. He asked, casually, who knew of Mr. Elwood's habit of solitary inspections. The vicar said everyone. Mr. Elwood was not secretive. Mrs. Tranter, with a smile sharpened to a fine edge, said that Mr. Elwood enjoyed a small drama now and again, where his benefactions could be seen to best advantage. One or two laughed and then felt dirty for it. As the autumn light thinned, the inspector made arrangements. The belfry would remain closed. Statements would continue at the village hall, where there was a decent table and chairs, and where Mr. Dilly could provide pens. The body would be removed with respect and doctor. Worsley would do what he could within the bounds of what ought to be done. People, dismissed from the scene, took their curiosity home under their coats. Miss Marple lingered long enough to see Tommy Bell slip, embarrassed and eager to be useful, around the side of the church to collect stray bunting and a hammer he had left by the porch. She saw him pause, stoop, and then hesitate, as if he had come across something he would rather not have found. He glanced about him, and then tucked his discovery deep into the pocket of his overalls. When he straightened, his face had the pallor of someone who has just realized that a thing picked up carelessly is heavier than it looks. She did not follow him. She did not need to. The evening bell, the one rung by hand for evensong on ordinary Sundays, would not be rung tonight. The great restored bell had made enough of a statement for any Sabbath. And in the hush that followed the clearing of trestles and the clink of cups, Miss Marple's thoughts arranged themselves, patient and without fuss, around a few small matters. A missing button, a smear of weathered metal, a sliver of varnish by a broken splinter, and a key that had not found its way home. Human nature, as she had often observed, is a very tidy housemaid. It puts things back where they do not belong with admirable efficiency. It was time, she felt, to see whose tidying had been too neat to be natural. The village hall smelled faintly of lavender polish and last winter's coal fire. Its long trestle tables, pushed together in a rough square, had been hastily cleared of hymn sheets and raffle prizes to make space for Inspector Graves's impromptu command post. A kerosene heater ticked faintly in the corner, its warmth drawing the damp from the air. The inspector sat at the head of the table with his pencil poised over a notebook. his face wearing the same reserved expression he might have worn over a hand of whist he intended to win without ever revealing his trump. Constable Pritchard stationed himself by the door, dutifully but not yet with the air of a man who could spot a liar at 10 paces. Miss Marple entered with Elspeth Harcourt, who carried herself with the faint air of a woman both curious and faintly amused to be involved in village drama. They settled along one side, neither too close to the inspector to be intrusive, nor so far as to miss a word. The first to be called was Lionel Baverstock. The churchwarden came forward with his usual stiffness, adjusting his spectacles and clasping his hands together on the table. Graves asked him to recount the morning from the time he arrived. Baverstock had been at the church shortly after 8, he said, to unlock the vestry and check the final arrangements for the unveiling. He had inspected the bell tower from below, but had not gone up. He had, however, seen Mr. Elwood the previous evening, at dusk, outside the church porch. They had spoken briefly about the plaque ceremony. Was anyone else present during this conversation? Graves asked. No, Baverstock said. His tone clipped. Mr. Elwood seemed preoccupied. He mentioned wanting to ensure the bell would be in working order for the unveiling. Did he say why? Only that a silent bell was a dead bell, and it ought to be rung if the tower was to be celebrated. He liked grand gestures. Graves noted this and asked about the missing key to the side door. Baverstock's brows drew together. As I told you, Inspector, I received it from the workmen yesterday afternoon and put it in my vestry desk. I cannot imagine where it has gone. Miss Marple, listening, thought it peculiar that he had not gone to the vestry before the ceremony to ensure all was in readiness. She knew from experience that people who loved keys also loved to check them. Baverstock was dismissed, and the inspector called Mrs. Amelia Tranter. The vicar's sister swept in with her pheasant feather hat slightly askew, settling her bag before her with a purposeful thump. Her account began not with the morning's events, but with the history of the bell tower restoration and her own role in fundraising, which she described as both arduous and indispensable. Graves let her run on for a time before gently guiding her back to the matter. Mr. Elwood, she said, as though tasting the name. We were not close, but one cannot ignore him in Winter Hollow. He was generous, certainly, though generosity can be a form of control. He was not above making his donations contingent on propriety. What sort of propriety? Oh, the kind that ensures one's name is on the lips of the vicar and in the minutes of the parish council. He took an interest in the accounts, which did not please everyone. Her eyes slid toward the door, as if to suggest the churchwarden waiting outside. I last saw him alive when I passed the bell tower steps just before the ceremony began. I was arranging the refreshments and noticed him speaking to Tommy Bell. They stood close, as though in some dispute. But when I came near, they stopped. Mr. Elwood went inside the tower, and Tommy walked off toward the trestle tables. This was the first mention of anyone seeing Mr. Elwood that morning before his death. Graves's pencil moved. You didn't mention this earlier at the church. I didn't think it relevant, Mrs. Tranter said, without a trace of embarrassment. Tommy is a shy boy. He might have been getting last-minute instructions. When she was gone, Tommy Bell was brought in. His cap was in his hands, and his eyes shifted between the inspector and the scuffed floorboards. He repeated what he had said before. He had been told to pull the plaque rope when signaled, and had not been in the tower at all that morning. When asked about speaking to Mr. Elwood, he hesitated, then admitted they had exchanged words. He said the rope was wrong, Tommy muttered. Said the cover rope was looped wrong, like it might catch. I told him it was fine, I'd done it before. Then he said I ought to check it just in case, but he was sharp about it, like I'd done something stupid. Did you go inside the tower after that? No, sir. I went straight round to the green. Mrs. Tranter was there. She saw me. Graves pressed no further, but Miss Marple, from her seat, noted how Tommy's hands kept brushing his trouser pockets, as if to reassure himself that something was still there. Next came Dr. Worsley. His account was brisk. He had been summoned, had climbed the belfry, found Mr. Elwood clearly dead, and suspected strangulation rather than a fall. There were no marks on the railing to suggest he had been forced over it. The position of the body suggested he had been dead for some minutes before being spotted. The cause, he said, was likely a cord or a thin rope applied from behind. Efficient. The sort of thing one sees in manual work, not in gentlemanly scuffles. That brought a flicker to Miss Marple's eyes. She thought of Tommy's hands, the missing button, and the varnish splinter in the tower dust. Statements followed from others in the crowd, most of them repetitive or contradictory. Mrs. Roper swore she had seen the shadow move in the belfry before the bell chimed. Mr. Dilly insisted nothing moved until after the chime. A few had noticed the wind lift the edge of the tulle tarpaulin, but only Elspeth thought it significant enough to mention twice. When the last of the witnesses had been dismissed, Graves leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. A quarrel with a carpenter's boy, a missing key, a dead benefactor in a locked belfry, and no one, so far, admits to being near him when he died. Elspeth Harcourt, never shy of inserting herself when curiosity got the better of her, said lightly, "In a village, Inspector, everyone is near everyone else, whether they like it or not." Miss Marple smiled faintly at that, but her gaze was fixed on the inspector. "You're wondering about the key," she said mildly. "If it was taken for a reason, and if it was returned where someone expected to find it. The trouble with keys, you see, is that they make people feel safe when they ought to make them cautious." Graves's mouth twitched, though whether from agreement or amusement, it was hard to tell. "Mrs. Marple, is it?" "Miss," she corrected, as she always did. "I should think if you could discover who had reason to want the bell to ring at that particular moment, you might learn why it was so important Mr. Elwood be in the tower beforehand. One does not ring a bell by accident, any more than one kills a man by accident." Her remark hung in the air a moment. Graves gave her a nod, a small acknowledgement, before standing to close the session. He left Pritchard to lock the hall and keep the statements in order while he went back to examine the tower again before nightfall. Outside, the air had grown colder, with a thin veil of mist curling at the edges of the green. Lamps glowed in cottage windows, and smoke rose in blue-gray streams from the chimneys. Miss Marple walked slowly with Elspeth toward the lane that led back to her friend's house. She made no comment on the afternoon's proceedings until they were well away from the hall. "Elspeth, do you remember, at the unveiling, where Mrs. Tranter stood?" "Near the gate, wasn't it? Giving orders about the tea." "And Mr. Baverstock?" "By the tower door, I think. Why?" "It is sometimes useful," Miss Marple said, "to think about who can see what and who wishes to be seen. I dare say Mrs. Tranter meant to be noticed. She has that air. But Mr. Baverstock prefers to be the one doing the noticing. And both had something to gain from a word with Mr. Elwood before the bell rang. Whether they had it or not is the question. They passed the churchyard, now empty save for the dark bulk of the tower against the pale sky. Somewhere within, the restored bell hung mute, its earlier chime lingering only in memory. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the small side door. A missing key, she thought, is much like a missing button. It is not the loss that matters, but who profits from its absence. At Elspeth's cottage, the kettle was put on, and a plate of seed cake was set out with the quiet efficiency of old friends. Miss Marple took her tea in silence for a time, then said, "I think I shall walk into the village tomorrow morning, if you do not mind. There are one or two things I should like to see in daylight." "You mean to investigate?" "My dear, I mean to look. Investigation is such a very active word, and I am far too old for anything active. But I have learned that people's truths lie where they put them most carelessly, in plain sight, and one must be looking the right way to see them." Elspeth smiled indulgently, but there was curiosity in her eyes. "And what precisely will you be looking for?" Miss Marple set down her cup with care. "For the thing that doesn't fit, and for the person who behaves as though it does." Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the path and softening the outlines of the church tower in the distance. Somewhere, a latch clicked, and the faint echo of it carried in the still air. Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful, for in a village, even the smallest sound might belong to something that mattered very much indeed. Morning broke pale and damp over Winter Hollow, the kind of half-light that makes even familiar lanes seem just a little less certain. Miss Marple was already awake, her knitting neatly folded away on the table, when Elspeth came down to find her, dressed for walking and fastening the buttons of her tweed coat. "You'll want your hat," Elspeth said, eyeing the low sky. "It smells like rain." Miss Marple agreed that it did, and in a few minutes the two of them set out along the lane toward the village. It was quieter than usual for that hour. The church tower loomed ahead, pale stone darkened in patches where the mist clung, the newly restored belfry a brighter gray than the weathered walls below. Miss Marple's route was not directly to the church. Instead, she made for the row of small workshops behind the green where Tommy Bell was likely to be found. The carpenter's shed smelled of wood shavings and linseed oil, and the rasp of a file came from inside. Tommy started when they stepped in, hastily setting down a half-planed beam. "Morning, Tommy," Elspeth said cheerfully. "We thought we'd see how you were getting on." Tommy mumbled something polite, but his eyes went to Miss Marple with a wary flicker. She asked if the rope for the plaque unveiling had been his work. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, I set it up. Mr. Sykes checked it." "And you've been helping with the bell tower for some weeks?" "Yes, ma'am. Every day till it was finished." His voice was steady enough, but he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. Miss Marple's gaze traveled over the bench. Among the hammers and chisels lay a coil of thin, strong cord, its fibers slightly frayed. She asked if it was for repairs. "Just left over from the scaffolding," he said quickly. "We use it to tie loads." She did not press the matter, but her eyes rested for a moment on his overalls. A faint greenish smear clung to the fabric near the pocket, very like the mark she had seen on Mr. Elwood's sleeve. She only smiled, thanked him for his time, and left him to his work. From there, she and Elspeth crossed to the post office, where Mr. Dilly was arranging the morning's letters. The talk, naturally, was of the murder, though no one called it that directly. Mr. Dilly said Inspector Graves had been at the church until late, going over the tower with a lantern. "Locked up the belfry tight as anything," he said, "though between you and me, half the village has been near enough to it this past fortnight. Keys don't mean much when there's scaffolding." "Scaffolding's down now," Elspeth remarked. Mr. Dilly nodded. "Aye, but while it was up, There were men in and out all hours, and not just the workmen, folk curious about the view or wanting to check progress. If you ask me, Mr. Elwood liked to make sure everyone knew it was his money paying for it. Wouldn't be surprised if he gave private tours. Miss Marple asked, as if idly, whether Mr. Elwood had any quarrels lately. Mr. Dilly's brows rose. Not loud ones anyway, but there's been talk about the accounts. Baverstock wanted to use some of the leftover fund for repairs to the vestry roof. Elwood said it must be kept for the bell. Stubborn pair, the both of them. Leaving the post office, Miss Marple led Elspeth toward the church. The main door was locked, but Constable Pritchard, on duty by the porch, recognized them and allowed them inside after a moment's hesitation. The nave smelled faintly of flowers from yesterday's service, but the air grew colder as they stepped into the tower. The wooden stairs spiraled upward in close quarters. Miss Marple took them slowly, her hand on the rail. About halfway up she paused, bending to examine the splintered step she had noticed the day before. The broken edge was fresh. The wood fibers had not yet dulled with dust. Beside it, the faint mark of a heel dragged across the grain. Above, the belfry platform was still and dim, the great bell looming over them. Miss Marple's eyes went to the railing where Mr. Elwood's body had been found slumped. The varnish was indeed new, and in one spot near the corner, a fine thread clung, almost invisible unless the light caught it. She leaned closer. It was pale gray, fibrous, no longer than half an inch, and frayed at one end. She glanced at Elspeth, but said nothing. "Miss Marple?" Constable Pritchard's voice echoed up from below. "Inspector Graves says he'll be by the green, if you're looking for him." They descended, and outside found Graves speaking to Mrs. Roper, who was delivering a basket of scones to the vicarage. When the inspector saw them, he excused himself and came over. "You've been looking at my crime scene, Miss Marple." "Your crime scene, Inspector, is also the church tower," she said mildly. "I wondered if you had discovered anything new." He gave a small shrug. "Elwood was killed in the belfry. No sign of a struggle, no footprints that shouldn't be there. If it was done with a cord, as Worsley thinks, it was quick. Whoever did it had reason to know exactly when the unveiling would happen. And how long before the bell chimed, the body was already there?" Miss Marple said softly. "It is curious, isn't it, that the bell rang at all?" Graves gave her a look that was not quite amused. "You think it wasn't an accident?" "I think," she replied, "that bells do not ring themselves. And if it was meant to be a dramatic reveal, it succeeded. But perhaps the drama was not for the benefit of the unveiling." They walked together toward the green. "Tell me, Inspector," Miss Marple asked, "who knew about the key to the side door besides the churchwarden and the vicar?" "The workman, certainly. Possibly Mrs. Tranter. She's been in and out more than most. And Tommy Bell, of course. And which of them would have been able to return it without being noticed?" Graves's mouth tightened. "That's the trouble. Any of them could have. Baverstock says it vanished from his desk. That means someone had to be in the vestry, and that's not a hard place to wander into during a busy morning." Miss Marple nodded, as though agreeing, though in truth she was thinking not of the vestry, but of the pockets of a certain young carpenter's apprentice. They parted at the green, Graves to continue his inquiries, and Miss Marple to escort Elspeth home. Once there, she asked her friend, "Do you recall if Mr. Elwood wore gloves yesterday?" Elspeth shook her head. "No, I should think not. He liked to shake hands, you know. But he had that dark overcoat, buttoned up." "Except for the one missing button," Miss Marple murmured. Elspeth frowned. You keep going on about that. What's a button to do with it? Sometimes, dear, it is not the thing itself, but where it came to rest. People drop buttons when they are in haste or struggle. They rarely notice until much later. And where a button falls can tell you where its owner has been. That afternoon, while Elspeth entertained a caller, Miss Marple took a solitary walk past the edge of the green, where the grass still showed the faint marks of yesterday's crowd. She crossed to the far corner by the hedgerow, stooped as if to inspect a fallen leaf, and found what she sought, a small, dark button, the thread still clinging to it. She turned it over in her palm. It matched the waistcoat Mr. Elwood had worn. It was not near the tower steps, but several yards away, almost at the point where someone might cut across from the side door toward the lane. A path that, in the hurry of preparation or escape, one might take without thinking. Miss Marple closed her hand over it. Somewhere in Winter Hollow was a person who knew exactly how Mr. Elwood had come to be in that belfry, and why the bell had chimed when it did. She had no intention of accusing anyone, not yet. Human nature, she reminded herself, always obliges with another clue, given just a little time, and she intended to give it exactly the time it needed. The next morning brought with it a thin, reluctant sunshine, filtering through ragged clouds and glinting on the dew-soaked grass. Winter Hollow looked deceptively peaceful. Cottage chimneys curling their ribbons of smoke into the sky, shopkeepers sweeping their front steps, the smell of baking drifting faintly from Mrs. Roper's kitchen. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the calm surface, the village was quietly buzzing with speculation. People were beginning to form their own narratives, and as always, those narratives rarely matched the truth. She set out toward the vicarage, her step unhurried. Inspector Graves had mentioned the day before that he intended to speak again with the vicar, and Miss Marple thought it might be useful to arrive while memories were still fresh, and tongues, perhaps, a little looser than they might later become. The vicar, Reverend Tranter, greeted her politely at the door, ushering her into the small book-lined study. His wife was out visiting parishioners, but Mrs. Tranter's presence seemed to linger in the polished neatness of the room. Graves was already there, seated opposite the vicar, pencil in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, "we were just discussing the morning of the ceremony. You might find it interesting." "I always find things interesting," she said mildly, taking the chair he offered. The vicar was explaining that Mr. Elwood had arrived unusually early, before 8:30. He had gone straight to the tower, carrying a small leather case. "A case?" Graves repeated. "Yes," the vicar said, frowning in recollection. "Rather like one a man might use for papers, or perhaps tools. I asked if I could assist him, but he said no, that he only needed a moment to put something in its proper place." His exact words. "And did you see him come out?" Miss Marple asked. "Number. When I returned from checking the flower arrangements, he was gone. I assumed he had gone home to dress for the ceremony." Graves made a note. "Did he seem worried? Preoccupied?" The vicar hesitated. "Perhaps determined, but not in distress. He was a man with a purpose." When Miss Marple left the vicarage, she did so with the image of Mr. Elwood ascending the tower alone, carrying something he intended to put in its place. If that place had been the belfry, then either it was still there, or someone had removed it before the bell rang. On the green, she saw Mrs. Tranter, brisk as ever, directing 2 church volunteers in moving trestle tables back into storage. Her pheasant feather bobbed as she turned toward Miss Marple with an expression that mingled welcome and calculation. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "I have been thinking how very distressing this must be for you, as a visitor to our village." "On the contrary, Miss Marple replied gently. I always find the study of human nature quite, what is the word? Instructive. Mrs. Tranter's eyes narrowed just slightly before she smiled. You will find, I think, that our village is full of loyal, decent people. Mr. Elwood's death was a terrible accident. Was it? Miss Marple said, with the faintest lift of an eyebrow. There was a pause, fractional but noticeable, before Mrs. Tranter replied, One can hardly imagine anyone here doing such a thing deliberately. She turned away to call an instruction to the volunteers, ending the exchange. From the green, Miss Marple made her way to the small cottage occupied by Mr. Baverstock. The churchwarden answered the door in, his shirt sleeves, spectacles perched on his forehead. I've no time for chatter, Miss Marple, he said, though he stepped aside to let her in. The inspector's been asking about accounts all morning, and I've got figures to check. Miss Marple seated herself primly by the fire. I should not take up much of your time. I merely wondered, did Mr. Elwood ever mention to you that he intended to make changes to the bell itself? Baverstock looked startled. Changes. Number the bell is as it has always been, save for the fittings. Why? Only, Miss Marple said mildly, I thought perhaps he had a reason for wishing to be alone in the belfry on the morning of the ceremony, a reason worth carrying a small case for. The churchwarden frowned. I never saw any case. And if you're suggesting he brought something to the tower, I've no idea what it could have been. He returned to his papers with an air of dismissal. That dismissal, Miss Marple thought, was a little too pointed. People who have nothing to hide rarely feel the need to shut down a conversation so firmly. By early afternoon, she was back in the churchyard, the autumn sun already dipping behind the tower. She walked the perimeter slowly, noting the trampled grass near the side door, the faint indentations where the scaffolding had stood, and the narrow path that curved around toward the hedgerow. It was here, yesterday, that she had found the missing button. Now, something else caught her eye. A small patch of disturbed earth, as though a heel had dug in hard. Beside it, almost invisible against the dark soil, was a short length of thin cord, knotted at one end. She bent to pick it up, holding it lightly in her gloved fingers. The fibers matched, in both texture and faint greenish-gray hue, the smear she had seen on Mr. Elwood's sleeve and on Tommy Bell's overalls. She tucked the cord away in her bag before anyone could notice. It was nearly tea time when she returned to Elspeth's cottage. Elspeth, who had been expecting her, had already set out the cups and a plate of currant buns. You've been busy? Elspeth remarked. Did you see the inspector? Not today, Miss Marple said. He will come to me soon enough, I expect. But I have seen things. Little things. Elspeth leaned forward eagerly. And what do they tell you? Miss Marple poured the tea with a steady hand. They tell me that Mr. Elwood died in a place where the killer was confident of not being interrupted, and that the bell's chime was no accident. It was intended to draw attention to the belfry at precisely the right moment. And I think the person who planned it also intended for someone else to be suspected first. You mean Tommy Bell? Miss Marple gave a slight nod. A young man with access to the tower, a quarrel, however slight, on the morning of the crime, and rope in his workshop. It is too neat. And life, Elspeth, is rarely so neat, without someone tidying it. As dusk fell, she took out the button and the piece of cord, laying them side by side on the table. Two small, ordinary objects. But in her experience, it was precisely such ordinary things that revealed the most extraordinary truths, once you saw how they fit together. The question now, she thought, was who had been in a position to plant suspicion on Tommy, and why they had needed to. That, she suspected, would lead her directly to the person who had been inside the belfry with Mr. Elwood before the bell chimed, and to the reason he had never walked back down those stairs. In Winter Hollow, the truth was very close, and when it came into the open, it would be as loud and impossible to ignore as the sound of a bell ringing across the village green. The following day dawned with a heavy sky, the sort that threatened rain without ever quite delivering it. The air was still, muffled, as though the village itself were holding its breath. From her window at Elspeth's cottage, Miss Marple could see the tower rising over the churchyard, its clean stone edges standing out against the clouded light. She thought it had the look of something waiting to be spoken to. By 9:30, she was making her way toward the green. It was market day, and a few stalls had been set up along the lane. Pots of honey, baskets of apples, jars of pickled onions. Villagers lingered in twos and threes, exchanging news in lowered tones that invariably circled back to the events of Sunday. The murder of Marcus Elwood had not yet been called by that name in public, but the word hovered in everyone's mind. She found Inspector Graves outside the church, speaking to Constable Pritchard. His expression was darker than usual, the set of his jaw suggesting he had reached an impasse. When he caught sight of her, he stepped aside from the constable and came toward her. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, "I've just come from Baverstock's." He claims to have remembered where he last had the side door key, but the story's thin as paper. Says he left it on the vestry desk while fetching a register, came back and it was gone. No one saw who took it, which means anyone could have had it. Not quite anyone, Miss Marple said mildly. Only those who knew it was there and knew what use to make of it. Graves studied her face. "You've something on your mind." She glanced toward the tower. "A few threads, Inspector. Nothing substantial. I'm afraid they tangle easily if one pulls too soon." Before he could press her further, Mrs. Roper came bustling up, a basket hooked over her arm. "Inspector, I do hope you'll be looking into that poor boy Tommy Bell before long. It's dreadful to say so, but it all points to him, doesn't it? Young men have tempers, and he had words with Mr. Elwood that very morning." "Did you see them quarrel?" Miss Marple asked, as though genuinely curious. "Well, no, but Amelia," Tranter told me she did, and Amelia doesn't say such things without reason. Mrs. Roper lowered her voice. "And Tommy was near the tower when it happened. My George said so. He saw him slip off toward the side just before the bell rang." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her a moment. Perhaps George might tell the inspector that himself. You know how stories alter in the passing. Mrs. Roper colored faintly, muttered something about her baking, and moved off. Graves gave Miss Marple a dry look. "It seems your Mrs. Tranter is very free with her observations." "She is a woman accustomed to arranging things," Miss Marple replied. "And sometimes, Inspector, arranging extends beyond chairs and teacups." They stepped into the cool dimness of the church. Graves led the way to the vestry, a small room of oak cupboards and narrow windows. On the desk lay the churchwarden's ledger, the pages neat with ruled lines and tidy figures. "I've been through these," Graves said. Elwood was indeed particular. He'd flagged certain expenses, mostly petty. The only substantial disagreement seems to have been over some additional carpentry work. By Tommy Bell? By his master, Sykes. Tommy was just the assistant. But it was extra work, and Elwood objected to the cost. Could be a motive, if you're looking for one. Miss Marple made a small, considering sound. She touched the edge of the desk. Keys are like ledgers, Inspector. They record not only what is there, but what is missing. Did you notice the dust here, just beside the blotter? There is a clear space, as though something lay here recently and was removed. The key ring, perhaps. He bent to look. Possibly. And the person who replaced it, if they did, would have had to be confident they would not be observed. She straightened. I wonder, Inspector, if you might allow me a few words with young Tommy. There is a manner in which boys answer questions when they are frightened, and a manner in which they answer when they are ashamed. The difference is often telling. They found Tommy behind the carpenter's shed, planing the edge of a door. He looked up warily as they approached. Tommy, Miss Marple said kindly, I was wondering about Sunday morning. You spoke to Mr. Elwood, you said? Yes, ma'am. He said the rope might catch. I said it wouldn't. Were you upset by what he said? Tommy shrugged. Not much. He was always sharp, not just with me. And after you left him? I went round to the green. Mrs. Tranter was there. I stayed till they called me to pull the rope. He hesitated, glancing toward Graves. I never went back to the tower. Miss Marple's gaze was steady on his face. Tommy, did you find something that morning? Something you didn't understand at first? His hand tightened on the plane's handle. No, ma'am. Her voice softened. When people hide things in their pockets, it is often because they are not sure whether to hand them over or keep them safe. I should hand it over if I were you. To the inspector. For a moment, she thought he would deny it outright. But then his shoulders sagged. From his pocket he drew a small square of folded cloth, a handkerchief. It was of fine linen, with a small embroidered M.E. in the corner, and a faint, irregular smear of green-gray across one edge. I found it by the side door, he muttered. Didn't want to get blamed. Graves took it carefully. You've done the right thing now. When they had left the boy to his work, Miss Marple said quietly, That mark is the same as on Mr. Elwood's sleeve, and I think the same as on that coil of cord in the workshop. Graves frowned. So he drops this outside the side door. That puts him there, at least. Could still be Tommy. He admits finding it. But why drop your own handkerchief if you are careful enough to hide a weapon? Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector. I think it was dropped in haste, perhaps in the act of returning the key. That afternoon, she took a solitary walk toward the far end of the village, where the lane curved past a row of older cottages. One of them belonged to Mrs. Tranter's cousin, though the lady herself was not at home. Miss Marple stood for a moment, looking at the narrow side path that ran from the garden straight into the lane behind the churchyard. It would be easy, she thought, for someone to slip through unseen, especially with the morning crowd focused on the green. On her way back, she stopped at the green just as Mrs. Tranter was finishing her errands. Such a pity, Miss Marple said conversationally, that Mr. Elwood didn't have time to make his final arrangements for the tower. Mrs. Tranter's smile froze for a fraction of a second before returning. Yes, quite. He was always one for making arrangements. Miss Marple inclined her head, and for ensuring his name was remembered, which is why I find it so curious that someone would risk tarnishing it. She left before the woman could reply, but she had seen it. The tiniest tightening at the corners of Mrs. Tranter's mouth, the sort of reaction one gives when an unwelcome truth has been brushed, however lightly. That evening, As she sat by the fire with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the little trail of small, ordinary objects: the button, the piece of cord, the handkerchief. None of them loud or dramatic in themselves, but together forming the faint outline of a picture. A picture in which the bell's chime had been the final, deliberate touch. Not an accident of ceremony, but a signal. And if it was a signal, then someone had been waiting for it. Someone who had arranged for the village's eyes to be drawn upward at precisely the moment they wished. She thought of Mrs. Tranter, the organizer, of Mr. Baverstock, the gatekeeper, of Tommy Bell, the frightened pawn. And she thought of Marcus Elwood, walking into the belfry with his small case, certain of his purpose, and entirely unaware that someone else's purpose would end his life before the bell's echo had faded. The truth, she felt, was nearly within reach. It only required one more thread to be pulled, and the whole careful weave would come apart in her hands. The following morning, the air had turned sharper, as if the season itself were drawing in its breath. A thin wind moved across the green, lifting the last of the leaves from the lime trees and sending them spinning across the cobblestones. Miss Marple, seated by Elspeth's breakfast table with a pot of tea, was knitting in a steady, almost meditative rhythm. But her mind, as Elspeth had long since learned, was anything but tranquil. Elspeth ventured, "I can almost hear the little wheels turning, Jane. You've that look you used to get before finding the missing piece in a crossword." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. "Crosswords are a matter of definition, dear. Murder is a matter of deduction. In both cases, it's the smallest clue that usually fits the gap." She rose presently and announced she would walk to the church. Elspeth offered to come along, but Miss Marple declined, saying there were one or two matters she must see to alone. She took the lane at her usual unhurried pace, stopping to greet Mrs. Roper, who was already setting out her morning baking on the window shelf. The woman tried again to discuss Tommy Bell's supposed guilt, but Miss Marple merely observed that suspicion often settled where it was most easily seen, whether or not it belonged there. At the church, she found Constable Pritchard leaning against the porch post, stamping his feet against the chill. "Inspector's inside with the vicar," he told her. "Going overtimes and such again." Miss Marple stepped in, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. Graves looked up from the ledger spread across the vestry table. "Morning, Miss Marple. I was just confirming who was where in the half-hour before the unveiling. The trouble is, everyone saw everyone else, or thinks they did. That is often the trouble with groups," she said. "They think proximity means certainty." The vicar, mild and grave, confirmed again that he had seen Mr. Elwood enter the tower early, but no one had seen him come out. Graves had established that the small case Elwood carried had not been found. "Could someone have taken it?" Miss Marple asked. "Possibly," Graves said. "Or it's still hidden somewhere in the tower. We've searched, but it's easy to miss a small object in all those beams and shadows." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the narrow staircase. "May I?" Graves hesitated, then nodded. She climbed slowly, her hand trailing the smooth new varnish of the rail. In the belfry, the air was cold, with the faint scent of linseed oil from the recent work. She stood for a moment looking out through the louvres at the village spread below. Then she turned her gaze inward, letting it rest on the trap door in the floor, the one that led to the narrow ladder used during the restoration. She knelt, running a gloved hand along the edge. A small burr of wood caught her attention. Beside it, wedged in the join, was a thin scrap of stiff paper. She teased it out. The torn corner of an envelope, bearing the embossed initials M.E. Mr. Elwood's case, she thought, had contained more than tools. Possibly papers. Papers worth hiding. She slipped the fragment into her pocket and descended, her expression mild as ever. Graves was still with the vicar. "Inspector," she said, "it might be worthwhile to consider not only who wished Mr. Elwood dead, but who wished something of his to disappear." He gave her a thoughtful look. "You think theft was part of it?" "Possibly not theft in the usual sense. But people will kill to prevent a thing being seen just as readily as to obtain it." After leaving the church, Miss Marple crossed to the green, where Mrs. Tranter was engaged in brisk conversation with Mr. Baverstock. They broke off as she approached. Mrs. Tranter's smile was fixed, Baverstock's expression pinched. "How very devoted you are to your morning walks," Mrs. Tranter said lightly. "Always about the village, taking everything in." "One sees so much more when one is unhurried," Miss Marple replied. "For instance, I noticed yesterday that the side path from your cousin's garden leads almost directly to the churchyard. Very convenient, if one needed to come and go without being seen from the green." Mrs. Tranter's eyes cooled a fraction. "I suppose it might be. But few people use it. There's no reason to." "No reason, unless one wished to avoid the crowd," Miss Marple said mildly. Baverstock made an impatient sound. "This line of talk isn't helping, Miss Marple. If you've something to say, best say it to the inspector." "Quite so," she agreed pleasantly. "And I shall. But sometimes it's best to speak when one's audience is most prepared to listen." She left them standing there and made her way to the carpenter's shed. Tommy Bell was alone, oiling a plane. His manner was less defensive than before, but he still glanced toward the door as she entered. "Tommy," she said gently, "you told me you found Mr. Elwood's handkerchief by the side door. Was it folded, as it is now?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. It was crumpled, like it had been dropped in a hurry. I just folded it before I put it in my pocket." "And did you notice anything else nearby?" He hesitated. Only a sort of mark on the ground, like a heel had twisted there. Fresh, because the grass was flattened. I didn't think it mattered." "It may matter a great deal," she said. "Thank you, Tommy." By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, bringing a faint drizzle. Miss Marple returned to Elspeth's cottage, her thoughts knitting together as neatly as her wool. She laid out her small collection on the table. The missing button, the piece of cord, the handkerchief, and now the envelope fragment. 4 ordinary things, each innocuous alone, but together suggesting movement. Someone leaving the belfry by the side door in haste, dropping or discarding items along the way. Over tea, Elspeth asked, "Do you know who it is, Jane?" Miss Marple sipped before replying. "I have a very strong notion. But it isn't enough to know, I must be certain. And to be certain, I shall need to see how someone behaves when they think the danger is past." "How will you manage that?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, by allowing them to believe that the inspector has fixed upon another suspect. Nothing provokes the careless gesture quite like relief." That evening, she sent a note to Inspector Graves, inviting him to tea the next day. She included, in careful script, a suggestion that he might hint to certain parties that Tommy Bell was to be charged before week's end. By the time she put down her pen, the drizzle had turned to a steady patter against the window. Somewhere beyond the darkened village, the great restored bell hung silent in the belfry. But Miss Marple knew that before long, it would no longer be silence that Winter Hollow remembered. It would be the moment when truth, like the toll of a bell, could no longer be ignored. By mid-morning the next day, word had seeped into Winter Hollow that Inspector Graves was moving forward with the case. The phrase was vague enough to encourage imagination, and imagination in a village is as quick to bloom as weeds in a summer border. By the time Miss Marple left Elspeth's cottage with her neat gray hat in place, she had already overheard Mrs. Roper telling the milkman that the boy will be taken in before Sunday, and Mr. Dilly at the post office informing a customer in a low but perfectly audible voice that Tommy Bell will find it's no good playing innocent. Miss Marple made her way to the green with the air of a woman entirely untroubled by the rumors. She knew very well that the inspector's supposed intentions were now winding their way into every parlor and kitchen, each retelling adding a little more certainty. And somewhere in the village, the one who had truly been in the belfry with Marcus Elwood would hear the talk and feel, for the first time since Sunday, the easing of a private knot of fear. She arrived at Elspeth's parlor precisely at the appointed hour to find Inspector Graves already there, standing by the window and sipping tea. He greeted her with a nod that might almost have been conspiratorial. "I've done as you suggested," he said quietly. "Let it be known, through the right ears, that Bell is likely to be charged. They'll be thinking they've got away with it, whoever they are." Miss Marple seated herself and took her own cup. "It's a dangerous sort of relief, Inspector. People are apt to loosen their habits when they think the danger has passed. And habits, you know, are the surest betrayers." The first visitor to arrive after Graves was Mrs. Tranter. She was all solicitous charm, greeting them both warmly and expressing her distress over the unfortunate business with Tommy. "So young," she said with a mournful sigh, "and to have such a thing on his conscience. Still, justice must be done." She talked at length, more than was her usual way in front of the inspector, about the importance of example, about how the village must draw together after such unpleasantness. And yet, beneath the smooth phrases, Miss Marple detected an ease that had not been there before. Something in the way Mrs. Tranter leaned back in her chair, in the unguarded little smile she gave when speaking of matters soon being settled. When she left, Miss Marple caught Graves's eye. He had noticed it too. Next came Baverstock, ostensibly to update the inspector on the church accounts. He was brisk, businesslike, and, unlike Mrs. Tranter, still wary. He asked after the key to the side door, repeating for perhaps the third time that he could not imagine where it had gone. "I'm sure it will turn up," he said. But when he heard that the case might be resolved with Bell's arrest, there was a fractional relaxation in his shoulders. After Baverstock had gone, Graves looked thoughtful. "They're reacting differently. Tranter's pleased, Baverstock's cautious but relieved. If they were both in on it, I'd expect more coordination." "Not necessarily," Miss Marple murmured. "People who share a crime are rarely as harmonious as one imagines. But I don't think they share it. Only one of them was in that belfry when the bell rang." The third visitor was not expected at all, Tommy Bell himself. He came hesitantly, cap in hand, and asked to speak to the inspector. "I heard folks saying I'm to be arrested," he blurted, "and I swear to you, sir, I never touched him." Graves reassured him that nothing had been decided and sent him on his way, but not before Miss Marple had noted the desperation in his voice and the lack of guile in his eyes. She was quite sure now that Tommy was no killer, though someone had certainly hoped to make him seem one. In the afternoon, Miss Marple excused herself and went alone to the church. The door to the tower was locked, but she had long since learned that a watchful presence can yield as much as a formal search. She settled herself on a bench in the churchyard, where she could see both the main door and the path from the side gate. It was quiet for nearly an hour. Then Mrs. Tranter appeared from the lane, carrying a small parcel. She went not to the vicarage, but directly toward the side gate. She glanced about, too quickly, and slipped through. A few minutes later, she emerged again, parcel gone, her pace brisk. When Miss Marple entered the church, she found the nave empty. But in the vestry, on the desk where the ledger lay, was a small leather case. It was scuffed at the corners and bore the initials M.E. in gold. She did not touch it, merely noting the faint trace of greenish gray on the clasp. She left quietly and returned to the green, where she met Graves coming from the post office. In a few careful words, she told him what she had seen. He went at once to the church, taking Pritchard with him. When they returned, Graves looked grimly satisfied. The case was there, just as you said. Inside were letters, most of them between Elwood and a London solicitor. But one is from Mrs. Amelia Tranter, written years ago and of a nature that suggests she would not want it seen. Strong hints about financial dealings in Bath before she came here. If Elwood had that, he could have forced her to do just about anything. Or, Miss Marple said, she might have decided to prevent him from using it at all. That evening, back at Elspeth's cottage, Miss Marple set down her knitting and said, "It will be tomorrow, I think. The inspector will have to confront her. But I should like to be present. People sometimes say the most revealing things when they believe they are explaining themselves." Elspeth poured the tea. "You really think she killed him?" Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "I think she met him in the belfry to discuss the matter in private. I think she took with her a length of that thin, strong cord, because she knew he was not the sort of man to give up an advantage willingly. And I think she rang the bell herself, just once, so that everyone would look up and see him there, already dead, before she slipped out the side door and returned to the green as if she had never left it." "And the things you found?" "They were simply what she left behind in her hurry. The button from his waistcoat during the struggle, the cord she used, the handkerchief that fell when she pulled the door shut, and the envelope fragment from whatever she rifled through in his case before hiding it away. They tell the story plainly enough, if one knows how to listen." Outside, the wind had dropped, leaving the village in a brittle, listening quiet. Somewhere in the darkness, the bell tower stood over Winter Hollow, its silence heavier than any toll. Tomorrow, Miss Marple thought, that silence would be broken, not by a bell, but by the truth at last. The next morning broke hard and bright, the sun glancing off the frosted grass in a way that made Winter Hollow look as if it had been dusted in sugar. The deceptive prettiness of the day seemed at odds with the purpose that had gathered Inspector Graves, Constable Pritchard, the vicar, and a few other interested parties, including Miss Marple, in the vestry of St. Cuthbert's. The inspector had asked Mrs. Tranter to come to clear up a small matter, which, in village terms, was as good as ringing the dinner bell for curiosity. Mrs. Tranter arrived precisely on time, dressed in a deep plum coat and a new hat with the same pheasant feather, which bobbed cheerfully as she stepped inside. She carried herself with a composed assurance. But Miss Marple, from her seat by the vestry window, noticed the slight quickening in the woman's breathing as she took in the assembled group and the leather case on the table. "Mrs. Tranter," Inspector Graves began in his level way, "we've recovered something belonging to the late Mr. Elwood, his case. You'll see it there." Her eyes flicked to it, then back to him. "And what has that to do with me, Inspector?" That's what I'd like to establish. Inside the case were several letters, including one from you, dated some years ago. A very particular letter. Would you care to explain why Mr. Elwood had it in his possession? For a moment, Mrs. Tranter's gaze was steady. Then she gave a light laugh. Oh, surely you're not suggesting it was a personal matter long past. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was gentle. Personal matters have a way of becoming very present, my dear, when someone chooses to keep them. I imagine Mr. Elwood was not the sort to let an advantage slip away. Mrs. Tranter turned toward her, the smile tightening. You seem to have taken quite an interest in all this, Miss Marple. One does, when one sees patterns, Miss Marple replied mildly. The pattern here is of a meeting in the belfry, before the unveiling. A private conversation, perhaps about that letter, which Mr. Elwood was unwilling to return. Words were exchanged, tempers too. And you, prepared for such an eventuality, had with you a length of thin cord. It would not take long, less than a minute, for a determined person to silence him. The inspector's gaze never left Mrs. Tranter's face. And then, Mrs. Tranter, you rang the bell. Just once. Enough to draw every eye in the village up to the belfry, where they'd see him, already dead, before you slipped away through the side door and hid the case until yesterday. She opened her mouth to speak, then shut it again. For the first time, the controlled mask slipped, and her voice, when it came, was edged. You're building quite a tale, but it's all supposition. Miss Marple's tone remained placid. Not entirely. There is the button from Mr. Elwood's waistcoat, found on the path from the side door. The cord, thin, strong, the sort a carpenter's apprentice might use, which bore the same faint smear of green-gray paint as the varnished rail in the belfry. The smear was also on Mr. Elwood's sleeve. Then there is his handkerchief, dropped near the side door, and the fragment of his envelope caught in the belfry trap. Little things, Mrs. Tranter, that on their own may be nothing. But together, they make a very tidy picture. Baverstock, who had been lingering near the door, cleared his throat. You mean to say she did it? Not Belle? Graves said nothing, only watched as Mrs. Tranter's hands, resting on the back of a chair, tightened until the knuckles whitened. He was going to ruin me, she said suddenly, the words sharp in the cold air. Over nothing, over a foolish mistake made years ago. He would have read that letter to anyone who'd listen, and She stopped herself, the realization of what she'd admitted flashing across her face. The inspector's voice was quiet. And so you stopped him. Mrs. Tranter's head came up, chin high. I protected myself, and this village. He was not the saint you all thought him. He used his money to keep people in his debt, to make them dance to his tune. I will not apologize for refusing to be another of his puppets. It is not your decision to take a life, Graves said. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Graves signaled to Pritchard, who stepped forward. Mrs. Tranter's composure settled back into place, though it had the brittle sheen of something cracked and remended in haste. I suppose this is the part where you take me away, she said. It is, Graves replied simply. As they led her out, Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She had seen that look before, the mixture of defiance and resignation. It was never as simple as villain and victim in a village. Motives were layered, grievances old and often half forgotten, until someone came along to pull them into the present. When the vestry was quiet again, Graves turned to her. You had her from the start, didn't you? Oh no, Inspector. Miss Marple said. At the start, I had only a death and a bell rung at the wrong time. But one watches, and one listens, and one notices who seems to fear suspicion, and who seems to welcome it when it points elsewhere. Mrs. Tranter was very quick to pass it along to young Tommy. Graves allowed himself a small smile. I'll have to remember that. And the bell. Ingenious in its way. Most people will remember the sight of him up there, not the moments before. She made sure of it. Indeed, Miss Marple said. People see what they expect to see, especially when their eyes are drawn by sound. It is much the same in life as in a conjurer's trick. The important part is happening where no one is looking. By the time she returned to Elspeth's cottage, the frost had begun to melt, leaving the village damp and glistening. Elspeth, of course, wanted to hear every detail, and Miss Marple obliged, though without relish. It is a sad thing, she concluded, when pride, fear, and a touch of vanity lead someone to an act they cannot undo. Mrs. Tranter will pay for what she did, but the roots of it go far deeper than a letter in a case. Elspeth shook her head. And to think, it all began with the restoration of a bell tower. Miss Marple looked out at the tower, pale against the winter sky. Yes, dear. In villages, it's often the smallest changes that bring the deepest troubles to the surface. The bell will ring again, of course, but I dare say it will never sound quite the same to those who heard it on Sunday morning. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock struck the hour. The sound was ordinary, almost comforting. Yet for Miss Marple, it carried the faint echo of that single, deliberate toll that had turned a celebration into a reckoning, and set in motion the slow, quiet unraveling of human intentions that had led, inevitably, to the truth. It was 2 days later when the village began, tentatively, to return to its usual rhythms. The market stalls were back on the green. The vicar's bell, one of the smaller ones in the tower, chimed for morning prayers, and Mrs. Roper's window was once again stacked with her tarts and seed loaves. Yet the air in Winter Hollow had altered. People spoke more softly in the lanes, glanced toward the church tower when passing, and quickly looked away again. In Elspeth Harcourt's parlor, the fire burned steadily in the grate. Miss Marple sat by it with her knitting, her needles clicking softly. Elspeth, at the opposite chair, had her embroidery in hand, but was watching her friend more than her work. "You're quiet, Jane," she said at last. "Even for you." "I am thinking," Miss Marple replied, "about how quickly a place settles back into its surface appearance, even when something so very ugly has occurred. It's human nature, I suppose. One wishes to believe that such unpleasantness was an aberration, not a reflection of something always present." Elspeth threaded her needle. "And yet, you always seem to see what's under the surface." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One learns, especially in a village. The same human patterns repeat themselves endlessly: envy, fear, resentment, pride. The only variation is in the details." A knock came at the door, and Elspeth rose to answer it. Inspector Graves stepped in, the brim of his hat damp from the morning mist. "Good morning, Miss Marple, Mrs. Harcourt," he said, settling himself by the fire when invited. "I thought you might like to know. The matter with Mrs. Tranter is concluded, at least from my end. She's confessed in full." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. "I suspected she might. People often feel a curious relief in confession. It spares them the strain of maintaining their own story in the face of the truth." Graves nodded. "She said Elwood had been threatening to expose her over those letters. Claimed he'd ruin her standing here. She tried to talk him out of it in the belfry that morning. When she realized he wouldn't yield, She used the cord she'd brought in case it came to it. Afterwards, she rang the bell to make sure everyone's attention was drawn at once. She counted on the shock of it fixing the moment in everyone's mind, so firmly they wouldn't wonder what had happened in the minutes before. And so, Miss Marple said, the thing she feared most, loss of standing, was brought about not by the letter, but by her own actions. One sees that so often. People protect themselves into ruin. Graves gave a wry smile. You were right about the small clues. The button, the cord, the handkerchief, the envelope. They were enough to turn suspicion away from the boy and toward her. Without them, I might have been looking in the wrong place for a good deal longer. They were only clues because they were out of place, Miss Marple said. Most things are just what they appear to be. But the moment they are somewhere they shouldn't be, they begin to speak. Graves took his leave presently, and Elspeth returned to her chair. You're very calm about it all, she remarked. If I'd just helped catch a murderer, I'd be flushed with triumph. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, there is no triumph in it. A life has been taken, another life all but finished, and an entire community reminded that it is never as free from malice as it would like to believe. One does not feel triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of having prevented further harm. In the days that followed, life in Winter Hollow resumed its familiar patterns. Mrs. Roper returned to her gossip, though now with more care in her attributions. Mr. Baverstock, perhaps chastened, was seen more often with a dust cloth than a ledger. Tommy Bell went back to his work in the carpenter's shed, his head down but his step lighter. And the bell tower, though still gleaming from its restoration, seemed to stand with a certain reserve, as though aware that its first toll in decades had not been the pure celebration intended. On the following Sunday, the bells rang again for the service. This time, the sound was bright, unshadowed by tragedy, though those who had been there the week before could not help but remember. Miss Marple attended with Elspeth, sitting quietly in the second pew, her eyes on the light filtering through the stained glass. When the final hymn ended and the congregation filed out, she lingered a moment, looking toward the tower. Elspeth followed her gaze. It will take time before people can hear it without thinking of that morning, she said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But time has a way of weaving even sharp memories into the general fabric of life. In a few years, it will be only a story told to newcomers. How the grand unveiling of the bell tower revealed not just the bell, but a murder. The details will shift, of course. Stories always do. But the truth, well, the truth will remain in the records, if anyone cares to read it. As they stepped out into the crisp air, the green lay before them, as it always had. Children chasing one another between the stalls, neighbors exchanging greetings. The surface calm had returned, but Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that beneath it, human nature remained unchanged. Given the right mixture of pride, fear, and opportunity, it would stir again. She and Elspeth walked home slowly, the sound of the bells fading behind them. In her mind, Miss Marple was already turning over the small observations she had made since arriving in Winter Hollow. How Mrs. Roper's tarts sold faster when she placed them by the door. How Baverstock polished the vestry silver as if it were a personal affront for it to be less than perfect. How Elspeth's neighbor claimed to dislike cats, yet left milk on her back step each morning. Patterns, all of them, harmless in themselves. But the same skill that noticed them could as easily detect patterns of a far darker kind. When they reached the cottage, Elspeth paused at the door. You know, Jane, You could do this sort of thing professionally? Miss Marple smiled as she stepped inside. Oh, my dear, I do. Only my clients are not always aware they have engaged me, and my payment is the quiet of knowing a wrong thing has been put right. She settled herself in her chair, the knitting once again in her lap, and the fire warm at her side. Outside, the faint chime of the church clock marked the quarter hour, steady and familiar. Miss Marple's needles began their soft clicking once more, her thoughts already slipping into that peaceful attentiveness that allowed her to see, hear, and remember everything. The bell tower at Winter Hollow would remain in the minds of the villagers, both a landmark and a warning. A reminder that in even the quietest of places, one toll might summon not just the faithful, but the truth itself. And Miss Marple, serene in her corner, knew she would be ready to hear it when it came. A week later, the last traces of the scandal had begun to dull, though they had by no means disappeared. Winter Hollow had an instinctive need to paper over its disturbances, much as a householder might lay a rug across a stubborn stain on the parlor carpet. People spoke of the business with Mrs. Tranter in low voices, as though it were a matter of ill health one ought not to dwell upon in company. The vicar, dignified but subdued, preached on forgiveness. Mrs. Roper found occasion to praise the inspector's diligence while still sighing over the waste of a capable organizer. And though the bell tower stood as clean and handsome as when the scaffold came down, the memory of its unveiling had settled in the village, like the echo of a sound no one wished to hear again. Miss Marple, however, was not one to turn away from a thing simply because it was uncomfortable. She had remained in Winter Hollow at Elspeth's invitation, enjoying her friend's company and observing, as she always did, the subtle shifts in people's behavior after a crime. It was on a bright but cold morning that she took herself for a walk, choosing the lane that passed the carpenter's shed. Tommy Bell was outside, mending the leg of a chair. He straightened at the sight of her. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. There was a lightness in his voice that had been absent before. "Good morning, Tommy. You seem busy." "Yes, ma'am. Master Sykes says we've more orders than usual. Folks want their houses in good order for Christmas." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "It's a good thing to be occupied. Keeps one from dwelling on past troubles. I hope you are not letting gossip trouble you." Tommy shook his head, a faint flush rising in his cheeks. "Some still look at me sideways, but I reckon it'll pass. People forget." "They forget what they do not wish to remember," Miss Marple said. "That is why it is important to be certain one's own conscience is clear, because it will remember whether one likes it or not." She walked on, pausing at the green, where Mr. Baverstock was fussing over the arrangement of the Christmas decorations. He acknowledged her with a nod. "We've had to rethink the tower's lighting, Miss Marple. The vicar feels it's best not to make it a focus this year." "Quite understandable," she said, "though it is a pity. Bells and light together are such a happy combination." Baverstock's face softened slightly. "Perhaps next year. We'll see." From there she wandered toward the churchyard, the frost crisp beneath her feet. She stopped before the side door of the tower, noting how it now bore a new lock. The key, she was told later by the vicar, was held only by himself and the inspector. It pleased her to see such precautions, though she knew locks were rarely the true safeguard. Human beings were far more permeable than doors. They opened to the right kind of pressure, or the right kind of appeal. That afternoon, Inspector Graves came to the cottage. He looked more at ease than she had seen him during the investigation, and accepted a cup of Elspeth's tea with genuine gratitude. "I've been thinking, Miss Marple," he said, about how it all might have gone differently if you hadn't been there. It's the small things you notice, the ones the rest of us step over. The button, the scrap of paper. They only spoke because they were out of place, Miss Marple replied. One learns to listen to small objects. People tell lies without meaning to, and sometimes without even knowing they have. But a button cannot lie. It can only be where it is, and that can tell you quite a lot. Graves smiled faintly. And I've learned something else from you. How the real key to a case isn't always the evidence itself, but how people behave when they think the matter's already settled. Human nature is wonderfully revealing when it relaxes, Miss Marple said. That is why your little rumor about Tommy Bell was so effective. The guilty can never quite help showing their relief when suspicion points elsewhere. They talked for a while longer, of the trial to come, and of the inspector's other cases. When he left, Miss Marple stood for a moment at the window, watching him cross the green. She thought of Mrs. Tranter, now awaiting the consequences of her choices, and of Marcus Elwood, whose plans for the tower had ended so abruptly. That evening, Elspeth broached the subject of her guest's departure. You've been here nearly 3 weeks, Jane. Will you stay on for Christmas? Miss Marple smiled. I should like to. But there are matters in St. Mary Mead that require my attention. Villages are much alike, you know. Problems bloom in the same way everywhere, and one must tend to them before they become too entrenched. On her last morning in Winter Hollow, she took one final walk through the village. She passed the post office, where Mr. Dilly was hanging a sprig of holly over the door. She paused at Mrs. Roper's window, admiring the rows of fruitcakes, and accepted a paper-wrapped slice for the journey. She stopped by the church, standing for a moment in the nave, listening to the faint creak of the rafters and the distant whisper of the wind through the belfry louvres. The tower stood tall and silent, its stone bright in the winter sun. She knew it would ring again in due course, for weddings and christenings, for the marking of hours and the celebration of seasons. But she also knew that, for some in Winter Hollow, its sound would always carry an echo of that Sunday morning, the sharp toll that had drawn every eye upward and set the truth on its slow, unstoppable course to the surface. When she returned to the cottage, her bag was packed. Elspeth walked with her to the station, the two women talking of small things, the quality of the mince pies at the church fair, the likelihood of snow before Christmas. As the train drew in, Elspeth pressed her friend's hand. You do have a way, Jane, she said. A way of making people tell you things without even knowing they've told you. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. People like to be listened to, my dear, and they rarely notice when, in the telling, they give you exactly what you need to know. She boarded the train, settled herself by the window, and watched Winter Hollow slide away. The fields stretched pale under the winter sky, and the hedgerows were strung with frost. She thought of the friends she had made, the quiet satisfactions of setting a wrong thing right, and the unchanging patterns of human behavior that would, inevitably, draw her attention again, before long. By the time the train rounded the bend and the village was out of sight, Miss Marple had already turned her thoughts to St. Mary Mead. There would be tea with old friends, and perhaps, if she was not very much mistaken, a small puzzle or two to keep her occupied until the next time a bell tolled in the wrong way, at the wrong moment, in the wrong sort of place. 2 weeks had passed since Miss Marple's departure from Winter Hollow, and in that time, the village had begun to close over the events of the bell tower, unveiling in the way a pond will smooth itself after a stone is thrown. The ripples of gossip had at last subsided into quieter eddies. leaving only the occasional whispered remark when two neighbors happened to linger over their shopping or pause in the lane. The vicar had returned to his usual round of parish duties, though his sermons carried a new gravity, as if the memory of that morning had impressed upon him the frailty of human virtue. Mr. Baverstock, subdued and perhaps chastened, was heard less often expounding on the accounts and more often seen attending to the humbler details of church upkeep. Even Mrs. Roper, who could never quite resist a morsel of speculation, seemed to have taken to heart the inspector's stern reminder about repeating unproven tales. The bell tower itself stood pristine and still, its stone bright against the winter sky. It had been agreed that the great bell would not be rung again until Christmas Eve, when it would toll with the smaller bells for the midnight service. And though its silence might once have been a disappointment, it had come to feel, to many in the village, like a kind of decorum, an acknowledgement that not every story is ready to be told aloud again. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had settled back into her familiar routine with the contentment of one returning to a well-tended garden. Her fireside table was once again occupied by a neat stack of knitting, a book or two from the circulating library, and the occasional note from a friend. Elspeth's letters from Winter Hollow arrived twice a week, full of small news: the success of the church bazaar, Tommy Bell's new commission to make a set of benches for the schoolroom, the rumor, unconfirmed, that Mr. Baverstock might stand for the parish council in the spring. One December afternoon, as the light was beginning to fade, Miss Marple sat by her fire with a cup of tea, reflecting, not with morbidity, but with that calm curiosity that was so much a part of her, on the matter of Marcus Elwood and the bell tower. It was not the crime itself that occupied her thoughts, but the manner in which it had come to pass. In villages, she mused, the roots of trouble are rarely sudden. They creep and twine through years of small grievances, unspoken slights, and quiet ambitions, until some seemingly minor event, a restoration project, an old letter brought to light, becomes the moment when they surface. And when they do, they often look, to the unpracticed eye, like a single rash act, when in truth they are the sum of 100 little causes. She had no doubt that Mrs. Tranter had, in her own mind, believed herself cornered, that the letter in Elwood's possession had seemed a weapon too dangerous to leave in his hands. Yet Miss Marple also knew that such moments of decision are rarely as inevitable as the guilty persuade themselves they are. Pride and fear often lend a false urgency to actions that might, with a little patience, have been avoided entirely. Her thoughts were interrupted by a tap at the door. It was Mr. Clement, the vicar of St. Mary Mead, come to return a book she had lent his wife. They spoke for a while of parish matters, of the choir's preparations for the Christmas service, and of the need for new hymnals. When he rose to go, he remarked, "I must say, Miss Marple, you seem in very good spirits these days. A restful visit to your friend, I trust?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Very restful, Mr. Clement, and as always, most instructive. People are endlessly interesting, you know. One never stops learning about them." When he had gone, she returned to her chair and poured the last of the tea into her cup. Outside, the early dusk had fallen, and the faint sound of the church clock drifted across the still air. She thought of Winter Hollow at that same hour, of the green with its frost-silvered grass, of the tower standing in its quiet vigil. Soon enough, the great bell would ring again, and its voice would carry across the rooftops. Some would hear only the present joy of the season. Others would hear, faint but insistent, the echo of that morning when it had tolled once for a man who would never leave its height alive. Miss Marple took a slow sip of tea. Human nature, she thought, was like the sound of a bell, capable of great beauty, but also of carrying far beyond the moment it is struck. And just as one cannot unring a bell, one cannot undo an act once it is set in motion. That was why, in her quiet way, she paid such close attention to the small signs, the stray words, the little objects left where they ought not to be. It was in those unconsidered things that one found the warning, if only one listened for it. The fire crackled softly, the room warm against the chill outside. On the table beside her, the knitting lay in a neat circle, the needles poised for the next row. She would finish it before Christmas, she thought, and perhaps send it to Elspeth as a small remembrance. It would be a comfort to know her friend was warm, even if the bells of Winter Hollow still held an edge of memory. The clock on the mantel struck the hour, its chime precise and modest. Miss Marple smiled to herself, picked up her needles, and began to knit again, her mind as serene as her hands were steady. Somewhere, in some other quiet village, another little puzzle would be taking shape, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. And when it came her way, as it surely would, she would be ready, as always, to listen, to observe, and when the time was right, to see it through to its end. It was the week before Christmas when a letter from Elspeth Harcourt arrived in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, sitting by her fireside, opened it with her usual neat precision. Elspeth's hand was brisk and tidy, but the contents were anything but ordinary. "You will be interested to hear," the letter read, "that Mrs. Tranter, before her removal to the county jail, asked to see the vicar privately. According to him, she spoke with unexpected frankness. She said that when she climbed the belfry that Sunday morning, she had not yet decided what she would do. The cord was in her pocket, for tidying a loose board on the stairs, as she put it. But she knew, deep down, why she had brought it. Elwood was already there, his case open, the letter lying where he could see it. She told him she would not be blackmailed, and he laughed. She said she only meant to frighten him into giving her the letter back. But when he still refused, pride took over, and the next thing she knew, the bell was ringing, and he was slumped against the rail. She swears she never planned it, but I dare say you, Jane, will have your own opinion on that." Miss Marple folded the letter and set it aside. She had heard similar stories before. A crime painted as a moment's impulse, as if that erased the preparation that made it possible. People liked to believe their worst acts came upon them suddenly. It made them feel less like villains and more like victims of circumstance. Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves telephoned. His voice, though steady, carried the satisfaction of a man closing a case properly. "I thought you'd want to know, Miss Marple. Tranter's confession matches your reconstruction exactly. The button, the cord, the handkerchief, the letter, they've all been accounted for. The jury won't take long." "I'm glad to hear it," Miss Marple replied, "though I dare say the real satisfaction lies not in the verdict, but in knowing the truth is plain for anyone who cares to look." "You always make it sound so simple," Graves said. "It is simple, Inspector. It's human nature. People arrange things to their liking, and in doing so, they leave patterns. If you've lived long enough, you've seen the pattern before. On Christmas Eve, in Winter Hollow, the bells rang for the first time since the murder. The great restored bell's voice rolled out into the frosty air, rich and full. The villagers gathered for the midnight service, the nave warm with candlelight, the air scented faintly of pine from the garlands. There was a solemnity to the sound, but also a note of release, as though the tower itself had been holding its breath. Elspeth wrote again a few days later. "It was strange, Jane. When the bell rang, I thought I would think only of that morning. But I didn't. I thought instead of you, standing on the green, looking at the tower with that sharp little gaze of yours. The sound was different this time, lighter somehow. Perhaps it's because everyone knows the truth now, and there's no more to hide. Miss Marple smiled as she read. She could picture it perfectly. The clean, cold air, the green dusted with frost, the tower standing over the village like a watchful sentinel. And she knew Elspeth was right. The sound would change, because memory had shifted. The resolution had been as inevitable as the toll of that bell on the unveiling day. A single, deliberate ring to draw the eyes of the village and disguise the minutes before. A scattering of small, ordinary clues, misplaced, mislaid, overlooked by all but the watchful. And finally, the loosening of a careful mask when the guilty thought the danger had passed. Miss Marple set the letter aside and returned to her knitting, the fire crackling beside her. The bell tower at Winter Hollow would fade, in time, into the village's store of stories, its sharp edges worn down by retelling. But for those who had seen it unfold, it would always be a reminder of how swiftly human pride could turn to human folly, and how, sometimes, the quietest observer saw the clearest of all.